My name is Lena, and I am 27 years old. I still remember the day everything changed. The day my body went numb, while my brother watched, laughing. The day my father told me I was overreacting, and my mother worried more about appearances than about me. If you've ever had your feelings dismissed by the people who should have cared the most, you'll understand my story. Because before that day, I had already spent a lifetime being in a family that only looked perfect from the outside. We lived outside Colorado Springs, in a neighborhood where the lawns were always neat and the neighbors smiled when they saw us. Everyone thought we were the picture of a happy family. My dad, Victor, worked long hours as an operations manager. He was strict, serious, and believed showing emotion was the same as showing weakness. He was raised in the military and brought that same mindset home with him. "Navarras don't whine," he would say. "Toughen up." That was his answer to everything. Whether I was sick, sad, or hurt, it never mattered. He thought pain was something you just pushed through. My mom, Miriam, was different, but not in a way that helped me. She cared more about what people thought of us than what was really happening inside our family. She was always smiling in front of neighbors, always telling people how well we were doing, but behind closed doors she mostly ignored me. If I complained or tried to explain how I felt, she told me I was exaggerating or being dramatic. And then there was my older brother, Evan. He was 3 years older than me, and from the moment he could talk, it felt like the world belonged to him. He was athletic, funny, and outgoing. Teachers loved him, neighbors adored him, and my parents treated him like he could do no wrong. He was the golden child, and I was the shadow standing beside him. Evan figured out early on that no matter what he did to me, our parents would take his side. When I was 7, he loosened the bolts on my bike seat. I didn't know until I rode it down the street and crashed hard. I ended up with a broken wrist. Evan told Dad I was clumsy and must have fallen on my own, and Dad believed him without a second thought. I still remember sitting in the urgent care, arm throbbing, while Dad lectured me about paying more attention. Evan sat there smirking, and no one even questioned him. Things like that kept happening as we got older. When I was 12, Evan locked me in the storm cellar during a tornado drill. It was pitch black, and even though I knew it wasn't a real tornado, I was terrified. I screamed until I lost my voice. When I finally got out and told Mom and Dad, they said I was making up stories for attention. When I was 16, Evan ruined my science project the night before it was due, dumping soda all over it. I cried, but my parents didn't even raise their voices at him. Instead, they told me I should have been more prepared. "Don't wait until the last minute," Dad said, as if it was somehow my fault. After enough times of being ignored, I just stopped trying. I learned to keep things to myself because there was no point. No matter what Evan did, it would always be twisted back on me. I grew up believing that my feelings didn't matter, that my voice didn't count. That kind of thing sticks with you. It teaches you to stay quiet, to hide your pain, to carry it alone. When I finally turned 18, I couldn't wait to get out. I went to college on the western slope, far enough away that I could finally breathe. Having my own space felt like freedom. I studied elementary education, rented a small apartment, and surrounded myself with friends who actually cared about me. For the first time, I felt like I could just be myself without worrying that every little thing would be criticized. Therapy helped too. It gave me the chance to talk about all the things I'd kept bottled up for years. Still, no matter how far I went, I could never fully cut ties. My mom called often, making me feel guilty if I missed holidays or family gatherings. "It would mean so much to your father," she'd say. Or, "Evan asked if you were coming." I doubted he actually did, but I always gave in eventually. I'd pack a bag, make the trip home, and brace myself for the same cycle. Every visit was a reminder of how little had changed. Evan would make jokes at my expense in front of everyone, Mom would comment on my clothes or my weight, and Dad would ask about my job as though it wasn't good enough. I'd smile, keep quiet, and count down the hours until I could leave. And even as I promised myself I wouldn't go back the next time, I usually did. Why? Because a part of me kept hoping. hoping they'd finally see me. Hoping they'd finally care. Hoping for a moment of kindness that never really came. What I didn't know was that all the years of cruelty and dismissal were leading to one day, a day when their refusal to believe me wouldn't just hurt my feelings, but would change my life forever. By the time I had been out of my parents' house for nearly 10 years, I thought I had learned how to keep enough distance to protect myself. Living on the Western Slope, teaching elementary school, and building a circle of friends who actually cared about me gave me something I had never experienced as a child, a sense of belonging. Yet no matter how much space I tried to put between myself and my family, there was always a pull. Sometimes it came in the form of guilt-laced phone calls from my mother, other times it was my father's curt demands that I make an effort, and almost always it was tied to Evan in some way. That was exactly how it happened the spring of his 30th birthday. My mother called one evening as I was grading papers. She skipped small talk entirely and launched straight into the reason for her call. "Lena, you'll come for Evan's birthday, won't you? He's planned something special, and it would mean so much if the whole family were there." Her tone wasn't really a request, it was the same soft-edged command I had heard all my life, wrapped in the language of family obligation. I hesitated, trying to think of a polite excuse, but she was quick to cut me off before I could even begin. "You've missed the last few gatherings," she reminded me, her voice light but sharp underneath. "Your father has noticed, and frankly it doesn't look good. Evan has invited so many people, some of his old friends from school, and it would be odd if his own sister didn't show up." I could hear the unspoken words behind her speech, appearances, always appearances, more important than my feelings, my boundaries, or my history with my brother. Part of me wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her I was tired of being paraded around like proof that our family was whole when in truth we were anything but. But another part of me, the same part that had always hoped for approval, hesitated. I thought about the last time I'd seen Evan, 6 months earlier at Christmas, when he had made some cutting joke about my spinster lifestyle, while my parents laughed along. I thought about how each visit left me drained for weeks afterward. And still, I heard myself agreeing. "All right, I'll come," I said, already regretting it the moment the words left my mouth. "Wonderful," she said with satisfaction, as though there had never been any doubt. "We're having a barbecue in the backyard. Your father built a new shed this spring, and Evan has been bragging about it to everyone. We're something nice, Lena. You know how important these occasions are to your father." The call ended shortly after, leaving me sitting at my desk, papers untouched, wondering why I kept allowing myself to be pulled back into their orbit. In the days leading up to the party, I tried to prepare myself the way my therapist had taught me. Deep breathing, mental rehearsals of polite but firm boundaries, reminders that I was an adult who could leave whenever I wanted. I told myself I would stay only a few hours, bring a card with some cash tucked inside, smile for the sake of civility, and then make my exit. It sounded simple enough in theory, but in practice I knew it would never be that easy. The morning of the party, I chose my outfit carefully. My mother's comment about dressing nicely had stung more than I wanted to admit. For years, I had been slowly building a style that felt comfortable to me, casual, practical, clothes I could move in without worrying about judgment. But I knew what my parents considered appropriate, so I settled on dark jeans, a blouse in a shade of blue I liked, and flats that wouldn't draw attention. It was a compromise between who I was and who they wanted me to be, and as I looked at myself in the mirror, I felt the familiar ache of never quite fitting their mold. The drive across the mountains took just over 2 hours. As the miles rolled by, my stomach churned with a mixture of dread and resignation. I practiced the lines I knew I would need, polite greetings, vague answers to probing questions, careful deflections when Evan inevitably tried to drag me into the center of one of his jokes. With every curve of the road, I tried to steel myself for what I knew was coming. When I finally turned into my parents' neighborhood, I saw the same pristine lawns and identical houses I had grown up around. Their driveway was already crowded with cars, a mix of shiny SUVs and flashy sports cars that clearly belonged to Evan's friends. I parked down the street, grabbed the envelope with his card and cash, and walked up the familiar sidewalk to the house that had never really felt like home. My mother opened the door with her usual polished smile, but her eyes immediately scanned me from head to toe, taking in my outfit. After a pause just long enough to sting, she leaned in with a quick air kiss. "You made it," she said, relief laced with something else. "Everyone's out back." Evan just opened his presents. Of course they had started without me. It was a small thing, but it carried the same old message: my presence wasn't essential, just optional. I followed her through the house, past a living room littered with wrapping paper and expensive gifts, designer clothes, golf clubs, even a set of keys that looked suspiciously like they belonged to a new vehicle. The contrast to my own 30th birthday 6 months earlier, when my parents had sent me a gift card with a generic, "Happy Birthday," wasn't lost on me. We stepped out into the backyard, and the scene was exactly what I expected. 30 or so people crowded around the new shed and barbecue area, drinks in hand, laughter loud and careless. My father stood at the grill, flipping burgers with military precision, playing the role of the proud host. Evan was at the center of it all, holding a beer, surrounded by his usual entourage. His once athletic frame had softened a little with years of indulgence, but his smile was the same, confident, smug, and just sharp enough to cut. When he spotted me, he broke from the group and strode over. "Little sis. You decided to show up after all," he said, pulling me into a hug that was too tight, too aggressive, a reminder of how easily he could overpower me if he wanted to. His words sounded cheerful, but the glint in his eyes told a different story. "Happy birthday, Evan," I said, forcing a smile as I handed him the card. He barely glanced at it before slipping it into the pile of other gifts. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the shed. "Dad finally finished this beauty. Built it from scratch. You've got to see it." I followed him reluctantly, my chest tightening with unease. Something about the way he looked at me, the way his friends watched from across the yard, made my stomach twist. I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was just another family gathering I needed to survive. What I didn't know was that this birthday party would be the last time I ever walked into that backyard without help. The backyard was buzzing with the kind of energy I had come to expect from any event centered around my brother. Laughter came in bursts, loud and careless, like the sound itself was meant to prove how much fun everyone was having. Evan stood at the center of it all, beer in hand, telling a story with wild gestures, his friends hanging on every word. It was the same scene I had witnessed countless times over the years, him basking in attention, me standing on the sidelines, trying to look like I belonged. I moved toward the drink table, grateful for something to do with my hands. I poured myself a glass of water, choosing it deliberately. Experience had taught me that alcohol only made me easier to target, and I needed to stay sharp. I took a slow sip and glanced around the yard. My father was at the grill, his movements precise and serious, as though cooking burgers were a mission requiring military discipline. My mother fluttered between guests, laughing at the right moments, keeping everything smoothed over. It was a performance I knew by heart. For a little while, I managed to stay out of the spotlight by chatting with a few of the quieter guests. Some of Evan's friends had brought their partners, and I noticed they looked as out of place as I felt. We formed a kind of silent alliance, standing at the edges, offering polite smiles and small talk while Evan's crowd grew louder with every beer. For a brief stretch of time, I allowed myself to believe I could get through the afternoon like this, just blend into the background, give Evan his birthday card, and escape without incident. But of course, peace never lasted long around my brother. I don't know what sparked it, maybe the alcohol, maybe the way I tried to avoid his gaze, but eventually Evan's attention shifted to me. "Hey," he called across the yard, his voice loud enough to hush other conversations. "Remember the time we convinced Lena that Mrs. Foster's dog had rabies? She was so scared she wouldn't go outside for a week." His friends erupted into laughter, the sound sharp and cruel. My cheeks burned, heat rushing to my face. I had been 8 years old when Evan and his friends told me that the gentle Labrador next door was infected and ready to bite me. The fear had been real, the nightmares even more so, but in this retelling, none of that mattered. To Evan, it was comedy. To his friends, it was entertainment. Or what about the shampoo swap? One of his oldest friends, Tyler, added, practically doubled over with laughter. Man, that was classic. They were talking about the time they had replaced my shampoo with hair removal cream. I had been 14, old enough to care deeply about how I looked, and for weeks I had gone to school with patches of missing hair hidden under hats. My parents told me to stop being so dramatic about it, and Evan had walked away unpunished, smirking the whole time. Now, years later, the story was still good for a laugh. I forced myself to stay calm, to take a slow drink of water, to not give them the reaction they wanted. But inside, shame and anger tangled together, familiar and exhausting. I had spent my whole childhood being the butt of Evan's jokes, the scapegoat for his cruelty, and here I was again, replaying the same script in front of an audience. I started to gather my things. Enough was enough. No family obligation was worth sitting through this kind of humiliation. I slipped my purse over my shoulder and turned toward the sliding glass door, planning to make a quiet exit. But Evan was faster. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path, his smile wide but his eyes sharp. "Leaving already?" he asked, his words slurred from too much beer. "The party's just getting good." "I have a long drive," I said firmly, trying to move past him. "Come on, sis," he pressed, leaning too close. "One drink with us, for old time's sake." His tone was playful on the surface, but I could feel the threat underneath. This was a routine I knew too well, the forced camaraderie, the pressure to play along, the inevitable humiliation that followed. "No thanks," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I really need to go." The friendly mask slipped from his face, replaced by something colder. "Still the same uptight Lena," he sneered. "Some things never change." His words landed like a slap, but I refused to let him see me flinch. I stepped around him and headed for the door, telling myself I just needed to grab my purse from the living room, say a quick goodbye to my parents, and escape. My chest was tight, my heart pounding, but I kept moving. I had survived countless scenes like this before. All I had to do was get out. The shed loomed at the edge of the yard, its fresh paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. Guests had been admiring it earlier, my father proudly telling anyone who would listen about the hours he had spent building it from scratch. Evan's words echoed in my mind, "You've got to see it." I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, as I crossed the yard, I caught sight of him following a few paces behind me, that same cruel gleam in his eyes. I didn't know it yet, but in just a few minutes, the shed would stop being my father's project or Evan's joke and become the place where everything I had been carrying since childhood would crash down around me. I was only a few steps from the sliding glass door when Evan called out behind me, his voice louder than it needed to be, cutting across the noise of the party. "Hey, Lena, before you run off, you still haven't checked out Dad's new pride and joy. The famous shed. Come on, you can't leave without seeing it." His friends chuckled, and I felt a pit open in my stomach. I knew that tone. It was the same one he had used 100 times growing up, the one that turned ordinary moments into setups for humiliation. I shook my head and kept walking, but he caught up quickly. "Don't be a killjoy," he said, steering me toward the far corner of the yard with one hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, not painful, but enough to remind me how much stronger he was. Guests were still talking and laughing, not paying attention to us, and I realized with a sick twist of familiarity that once again no one was going to step in. The shed was new, larger than I expected, its fresh paint still smelling faintly of chemicals in the summer heat. The door was propped open, shadows pooling inside. I hesitated at the threshold, uneasy, but Evan grinned and pushed lightly at my back. "Go on," he said. "It's perfectly safe. Dad built it himself." There was a mocking edge to his voice, the kind of edge that told me this was not about showing me his father's craftsmanship. I stepped inside cautiously. The air was cooler, but also thick with the scent of wood and motor oil. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling gave off a weak glow, just enough to make out shelves stacked with tools, boxes, and paint cans. Before I could turn to leave, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound loud and final. I spun around and rattled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. From the other side came the unmistakable sound of Evan's laughter. "Lighten up, sis," he called. It's just a joke. My chest tightened. Childhood panic came rushing back, the storm cellar, the locked doors, the dark spaces where I had been left to scream while no one listened. I pounded on the door. Evan, let me out. This isn't funny. My voice cracked, but my words only made him laugh harder. I turned back into the shed, trying to keep myself calm, but my foot caught on something lying across the floor. I stumbled sideways into one of the tall shelves. It rocked under my weight, and before I could steady myself, it tipped. The crash was deafening. Boxes, tools, and heavy cans rained down on me. A sharp, crushing pain shot through my back as something heavy pinned me to the floor. My head struck the concrete hard enough to send sparks across my vision. I gasped for breath, the air knocked out of me. My arms flailed against the debris, pushing uselessly. Instinctively, I tried to move my legs to shift myself free, but nothing happened. No matter how hard I willed them, they stayed still, heavy and foreign, as though they no longer belonged to me. A wave of cold terror swept over me, sharper than the pain itself. Help. My voice was ragged, barely loud enough to carry through the thick wooden door. Evan, I can't move. Please, get someone. I need help. The door creaked open after what felt like forever. Evan's silhouette filled the frame, his grin still plastered across his face. Nice fall, Lena, he said. You really should take up theater. That was dramatic. I tried to sit up, but my body refused. My arms trembled as I pushed at the floor, but the weight on my back and the terrifying emptiness below my waist made it impossible. Tears stung my eyes. I'm serious, Evan, I begged. I can't feel my legs. Something's really wrong. Please, call an ambulance. He rolled his eyes and glanced over his shoulder, where a couple of his friends had gathered to watch. She's fine, he told them. She always does this. Anything for attention. The words pierced deeper than any wound, not because they were new, but because they were so familiar. I had heard variations of them all my life, from my parents, from Evan, from anyone who found it easier to doubt me than to face the truth. Even now, lying on the ground unable to move, my pain was nothing more than another punchline. My father appeared in the doorway next, his face drawn tight with irritation. What's going on here? He demanded. Dad, I sobbed, relief rushing through me at the sight of him. Surely he would help. I fell. The shelf collapsed. I can't move my legs. Please, I need a hospital. But instead of concern, he gave me the same dismissive look I had seen 1,000 times before. For God's sake, Lena, the shed is perfectly safe. Stop being dramatic. You're embarrassing your brother in front of his friends. The words knocked the breath out of me more than the fall had. Even here, in this moment, they chose denial. My body screamed with pain, my mind screamed with panic, and still I was treated as though I were making it up. My mother hovered behind my father, wringing her hands, whispering about the guests watching, about not making a scene. The room tilted, my vision blurring at the edges. The smell of oil and dust filled my nose, mixing with the coppery tang of fear in my mouth. I tried again to move my legs, even the smallest twitch, but there was nothing, just a hollow silence where my body should have responded. Somewhere in the distance, laughter had faded, replaced by murmurs of unease. But no one bent down to help me, no one called for an ambulance, not until a firm, unfamiliar voice cut through the noise. I'm a nurse, it said. Step aside. For the first time since the shelf came crashing down, I felt a flicker of hope. The nurse pushed through the small crowd that had gathered around the shed door, her presence steady and purposeful in a way that immediately set her apart from everyone else. She was in her early 30s, with her dark hair tied back and a calm but determined expression on her face. My name is Rachel, she said, crouching down beside me. I work in the ER at Memorial Hospital. Don't try to move, Lena, just stay as still as you can. Her voice cut through the panic fogging my mind. She spoke with the kind of authority that left no room for argument, and I clung to it like a lifeline. She checked my pulse at my wrist, her fingers cool and firm, then lightly pressed along my legs. "Can you feel this?" she asked. "No," I whispered, tears sliding down my temples onto the concrete. "I can't feel anything below my waist. Please, I need help." "You do," she agreed quickly, her voice steady but urgent. She reached into her pocket for her phone. "I'm calling an ambulance. You may have a spinal injury. It's critical that you don't move until paramedics arrive." Behind her, my mother's voice broke in, sharp with anxiety. "That's not necessary," she protested. "She's always been dramatic, always making things bigger than they are. She just needs to calm down and get up." Rachel's head snapped up, her eyes hardening. "Ma'am, your daughter cannot move her legs. That is not drama. That is a medical emergency." Her tone was professional but uncompromising, and for the first time, I saw my mother falter. Still, my father bristled, stepping forward as though Rachel's presence in his backyard was an intrusion. "The shed is perfectly safe. I built it myself. If she got hurt, it's because she wasn't paying attention. You don't need to call anyone, we can handle this." Rachel didn't even look at him. She was already speaking to the dispatcher, her free hand resting lightly but firmly on my shoulder to keep me still. She described my fall, my loss of sensation, the location of the house. Her calm, efficient tone felt like the only thing tethering me to the world. As she spoke, Evan lingered in the doorway of the shed, his usual smirk gone. His face was pale now, his jaw tight. He didn't meet my eyes. "It was just a joke," he muttered, low enough that only a few of us heard. "I didn't think she'd actually get hurt." The words fell into the silence like stones. Rachel looked at him sharply. "You deliberately created a dangerous situation?" she asked. Evan shifted, stuffing his hands into his pockets like a child caught stealing. "I just locked her in for fun. I didn't know the shelf would fall." Rachel's expression darkened, but she didn't press further. She focused back on me, speaking quietly. "You're doing well, Lena. The ambulance is on its way, just a few more minutes. Try to keep breathing steady." Around us, the party had grown eerily quiet. Guests had stepped back, murmuring to one another, some clearly uncomfortable, others looking for excuses to leave before they became too entangled. My mother smoothed the front of her dress with nervous hands, whispering to no one in particular about how awful this all looked, how people would talk. My father stood stiff and angry, as though the real offense was the disruption of his carefully planned afternoon. The pain in my back was spreading, radiating outward in waves that made it hard to focus. My head throbbed where it had struck the floor, nausea curling in my stomach. A strange tingling had begun in my fingertips, and the fear that something inside me was breaking in ways I couldn't see threatened to swallow me whole. "Please," I whispered to Rachel, my voice barely audible. "Don't let them ignore me again." Her eyes softened, and she leaned close so only I could hear. "I won't. You're not alone in this anymore." The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the tension. Louder and louder, until finally red and blue lights washed across the yard. Paramedics rushed in with practiced efficiency, wheeling a stretcher through the narrow gate. Rachel immediately stood to brief them, giving a crisp summary of my symptoms and the events leading up to the fall. The lead paramedic, a woman named Sarah according to her name tag, crouched beside me. "Hi, Lena, I'm Sarah. We're going to take good care of you. Can you tell me where the pain is worst?" "My lower back," I whispered, my throat raw. "And my head. But I can't move my legs. I can't feel them." Sarah nodded, her expression serious but kind. "All right. We're going to put a collar around your neck to protect your spine, then we'll move you onto a backboard. Don't try to help us, just stay as still as possible. I know it's scary, but we've got you." As they worked, I could hear my parents hovering nearby. My mother asked in a hushed, worried tone if this was really necessary, if maybe they could just drive me to urgent care themselves. Sarah's answer was firm, almost identical to Rachel's earlier. "Absolutely not. Any movement could make the injury worse. She needs proper immobilization and transport. For once, my father said nothing. He stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the paramedics and the neighbors who were now openly staring. It was the first time I had seen him truly at a loss for words, and in that moment, I understood that the reality of what was happening was finally beginning to pierce through his denial. The paramedics placed the cervical collar around my neck, then carefully coordinated their movements as they rolled me onto the backboard. Even with their care, the pain was so sharp I cried out, the sound torn from me without permission. Sarah murmured apologies as they secured me, telling me over and over that it was almost done. When they lifted me onto the stretcher, I caught one last glimpse of my family standing together near the shed. My father looked rigid and furious, my mother pale and wringing her hands, Evan staring at the ground like a boy who finally understood the weight of what he had done. And then the stretcher was moving, the ambulance doors closing behind me, the world narrowing to the rhythm of monitors and the steady voices of people who, unlike my family, finally believed that my pain was real. The ambulance ride was a blur of sound and motion, a mixture of sirens, clipped medical terms, and the sting of needles as they started in 4. I remember the cool rush of oxygen filling my lungs, the paramedics' calm instructions, and the unshakable fear that no matter what they did, my legs would stay lifeless forever. Somewhere between the pain medication and the exhaustion, I slipped into darkness, and the next time I opened my eyes I was lying in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and humming machines. The ceiling above me was stark white, too bright against the haze in my mind. For a moment I wasn't sure where I was or why, but then the memories rushed back, the shed, the crash of the shelf, Evan's laughter, my father's voice dismissing me even as I begged for help. My chest tightened, and tears stung my eyes before I could stop them. A nurse noticed I was awake and came quickly to my side. He introduced himself as Carlos, his tone gentle but efficient. "Welcome back, Lena. You're at Memorial Hospital. You've been in and out of consciousness for about 12 hours. Can I get you some water?" I nodded, my throat dry and raw. He helped me take a few careful sips through a straw, then adjusted the bed so I was more upright. Even that small shift sent fire shooting down my spine, and I bit back a cry. "What's wrong with me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why can't I move my legs?" Carlos's expression softened, though his professional mask never slipped entirely. "The doctor will explain everything. She'll be here shortly. Just try to stay calm for now. You're safe." A few minutes later, a woman in a white coat entered the room, her hair streaked with silver and tied back neatly, her presence both authoritative and kind. "Good morning, Lena," she said, pulling a chair to my bedside. "I'm Dr. Martinez, the neurosurgeon who's been overseeing your care." She glanced at the chart in her hands, then looked directly at me. "I know you've been through a lot, and you probably have many questions." I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I can't feel my legs. Am I paralyzed?" Dr. Martinez nodded slowly, choosing her words with care. "When you fell, you suffered an incomplete spinal cord injury at the T12-L1 level of your spine. That means the vertebrae in your lower back fractured and fragments compressed your spinal cord. We performed emergency surgery to remove the fragments and stabilize your spine with rods and screws. The surgery went well, but the injury itself is significant." Her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and immovable. "Incomplete," I repeated numbly. "What does that mean?" "It means your spinal cord wasn't completely severed," she explained. "That's positive news. It means there is a chance for some recovery of function, though it's impossible to predict how much. Some patients regain mobility with rehabilitation, others see only partial improvement. Right now, you're experiencing paraplegia, which is paralysis affecting the lower half of your body." I let out a shaky breath, my vision blurring with tears. "So, I might never walk again?" "There's no way to know yet," Dr. Martinez said gently. "The fact that your injury is incomplete is encouraging, but the next several months will be critical. With time, physical therapy, and careful management, you may regain some movement and sensation. We'll work with you every step of the way." Her words were meant to comfort me, but all I could hear was the possibility that the life I had known was gone forever. My legs felt like they were there, but when I tried to move them, there was nothing, just an emptiness where control used to be. I turned my head toward the wall, unable to stop the sobs that rose from somewhere deep inside me. Dr. Martinez gave me a moment, then continued, her tone shifting slightly. Lena, there's something else we need to discuss. Because of the circumstances of your injury, the police are involved. They've already spoken to some of the witnesses from the party, and they would like to speak with you when you feel ready. The words sliced through my grief, bringing anger to the surface. Evan, I said bitterly. He locked me in that shed. He laughed when I begged for help. He told everyone it was a joke. Dr. Martinez nodded. That's consistent with what we've heard from others, including the nurse who assisted you and the paramedics who transported you. Your brother has been taken into custody. He's facing charges of reckless endangerment resulting in serious bodily injury. As for your parents, the authorities are reviewing their response. The delay in seeking medical help may qualify as negligence. The room seemed to tilt. I had dreamed of my family facing consequences before, but now that it was happening, the reality felt heavier than I had expected. So they might go to jail? I asked softly. That decision will be up to the district attorney and the courts, Dr. Martinez replied. But yes, these are serious charges. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, the pain in my body, the uncertainty of my future, the shocking truth that my family's betrayal was finally visible to the world, undeniable and documented. For years I had been silenced, dismissed, treated as though my suffering were nothing but drama. Now there were medical charts, police reports, and witness statements that said otherwise. For the first time in my life, someone believed me. But the cost of that validation was almost unbearable. The days that followed were a blur of pain medication, routine checks, and the constant hum of machines reminding me that my body was no longer my own. Nurses came and went, adjusting monitors and repositioning me when I couldn't do it myself. Each small movement sent shockwaves through my back, and every attempt to shift on my own ended with the same terrifying result, my legs lying motionless, unresponsive, as though they belonged to someone else. But even through the haze of pain, I couldn't ignore the steady presence of law enforcement. 2 women came to my room on the 3rd day, introducing themselves as Detective Sullivan and Officer Chin. They pulled up chairs and spoke to me in voices that were calm but carried a gravity I had rarely experienced when talking about my family. We understand this is difficult, Detective Sullivan began. But we need to hear your account of what happened at the party. And so, for the first time, I told it all in one breath. I described the way Evan had steered me toward the shed, how the door slammed behind me, how the shelf had collapsed under my weight, how I had screamed for help only to be met with laughter and accusations of dramatics. I told them about my father brushing it off, about my mother whispering that I was embarrassing the family, about the long minutes that passed before Rachel, the nurse, stepped in and forced them to take my pain seriously. When I finished, my voice was raw, and my hands trembled against the sheets. Officer Chen had been taking careful notes, and she looked up, her expression steady but compassionate. So, to be clear, you reported you could not move or feel your legs, and no one called for medical assistance until a guest intervened? That's right, I said, my throat tightening. They didn't believe me. They never do. The women exchanged a glance before Detective Sullivan leaned forward slightly. Your brother has already admitted to locking you in the shed and said he didn't expect you to get hurt. We've spoken to witnesses who confirmed his words. He's currently in custody, charged with felony reckless endangerment resulting in serious bodily injury. The words landed heavily, even though I had expected them. Evan had been cruel my entire life, but hearing his cruelty described in legal terms was surreal. For so long, my suffering had been invisible, dismissed as exaggeration. Now it had a label, a charge, a weight in the eyes of the law. And your parents, Officer Chen added carefully, are under investigation for negligence and failure to provide necessary medical assistance. That part is still being reviewed by the district attorney. I stared at the blanket pulled up over my lap, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. My parents could face charges. My brother could go to prison. Part of me felt a strange sense of validation, a deep relief that someone outside my family finally saw what I had lived with for years. But another part of me felt hollow. These were my parents, my brother, my family. No matter how broken they were, some piece of me had never truly imagined this ending. The detectives thanked me for my cooperation and promised to keep me updated. When they left, the room felt too quiet. I listened to the beeping of the monitors, the sound of nurses moving in the hall, the faint hum of air conditioning, and tried to process the fact that my life had permanently split into before and after. Over the next week, the updates trickled in. Evan accepted a plea deal that would likely send him to prison for several years. My parents, facing lesser charges, were expected to receive probation and community service. When my attorney, a calm and measured man named Michael Greenberg, came to see me, he explained that in addition to the criminal cases, I had grounds to pursue a civil lawsuit. Medical expenses for spinal cord injuries can reach into the millions over a lifetime, he said gently, setting a stack of papers on the table by my bed. That includes surgeries, therapy, equipment, home modifications, and lost wages. Your brother and parents are liable, and while their homeowner's insurance will cover some of the costs, it won't come close to addressing everything you'll need. I listened, numb, as he described the process of filing suit. He talked about depositions, settlements, and trust funds, about how my parents might have to sell assets to cover damages. My first instinct was resistance. "They're still my family," I murmured, my voice breaking. Michael nodded, his eyes kind but unyielding. "I understand. But Lena, this isn't about punishment. This is about ensuring you have what you need to live as fully and independently as possible. You deserve that." I thought about my hospital room, the rails on the bed, the chair by the window where I couldn't yet sit, the endless medical supplies. I thought about the bills that were already piling up, bills I would never be able to cover on a teacher's salary. And slowly, painfully, I realized he was right. So I agreed. The legal battle stretched out in front of me like a road I didn't want to walk, but had no choice but to follow. Evan would face prison. My parents would face judgment. And I would face a lifetime of recovery, a lifetime reshaped by a single moment in a shed. Lying there in that hospital bed, staring at my motionless legs under the blanket, I wondered which hurt more, the physical injury that had changed my body, or the emotional truth that my family's betrayal had finally been laid bare for the world to see. After 2 weeks in the hospital, once the doctors were satisfied that my spine was stable and the risk of infection had lowered, I was transferred to a rehabilitation center on the edge of town. It was a place I had never paid much attention to before, even though I must have driven past it countless times. The building was modern and low to the ground, with wide automatic doors and long hallways designed for wheelchairs. I remember being rolled inside on a stretcher, staring up at the fluorescent lights, and realizing that this was where I would spend the next chapter of my life, not teaching children in my classroom, not meeting friends for coffee, but relearning how to exist in a body that no longer obeyed me. The first few days were overwhelming. I was introduced to a team of people who would become my lifeline: physical therapists, occupational therapists, rehabilitation nurses, a psychologist, and even a social worker assigned to help me navigate the endless paperwork. They spoke with confidence about goals and progress, about building strength and independence, but I felt like I was listening from underwater. All I could think about was the fact that I could not move my legs, and the fear that I might never truly move them again. My primary physical therapist was a man named David, who carried himself with the steady patience of someone who had seen hundreds of patients walk, or wheel, through these doors. He sat with me on my first day, looking me straight in the eye. "Our goal is to help you regain as much function as possible," he said, his tone both honest and encouraging. "But equally important is learning how to live independently with the function you have right now. Progress may be slow. Some days it might feel non-existent. But every effort you make counts." It was a speech he had probably given to dozens of patients, yet something about his calm certainty steadied me. He didn't promise miracles, but he didn't frame my life as over either. For the first time since the accident, I felt a small flicker of hope. The days quickly settled into a routine that was both exhausting and strangely comforting. Mornings began with 2 hours of physical therapy. At first it was simply about learning to shift myself in bed, about building strength in my arms and core so I could transfer from the bed to a wheelchair with less assistance. Then we practiced standing between parallel bars with the help of braces and support belts, my arms trembling as I gripped the rails, sweat running down my face as I tried to coax even the smallest movement from muscles that had forgotten how to respond. Sometimes I managed a flicker of sensation, a twitch of a thigh muscle, or the faintest lift of a hip. Other times, there was nothing but silence from my body. Those days were the hardest, because each failure felt like confirmation of my deepest fear. Afternoons were filled with occupational therapy, which focused less on movement and more on everyday survival. I learned how to dress myself from a seated position, how to cook simple meals from a wheelchair, how to maneuver through narrow doorways and around obstacles. These sessions were humbling, because they forced me to acknowledge all the small, invisible ways my life had changed. Tasks I had once done without a thought now required strategy, tools, and patience. There were group therapy sessions too, where I met others living with spinal cord injuries. Some were older, injured in accidents years ago, returning for refresher therapy. Others were new, like me, still raw with grief and shock. One of them was a woman named Tara, who had been paralyzed in a car accident 2 years earlier. She could walk short distances with braces and forearm crutches, though she still relied on her wheelchair most of the time. One evening, while we sat together during the communal dinner, she leaned toward me and said, "It doesn't get easier, not really. But you do get stronger. And eventually, this stops being your whole identity. It becomes just one part of your life." Her words stuck with me. At first I couldn't imagine ever feeling that way. My injury felt like the center of everything, like it defined who I was and who I could ever be. But seeing Tara move with a quiet confidence, laughing with nurses, talking about her plans for graduate school, gave me a glimpse of a different future, one I hadn't dared to picture yet. There were setbacks too. The weeks were punctuated by infections, days when pain made progress impossible, moments of despair so sharp I didn't know how I would keep going. I cried more in those months than I had in years, sometimes silently in the middle of the night, sometimes openly in front of the staff who reminded me again and again that my feelings were valid. Unlike my family, they didn't dismiss my tears as dramatics. They treated them as part of the healing process. That alone was a revelation. What struck me most during my time in rehabilitation was the absence of my family. My parents never visited. Evan, of course, couldn't, since he was behind bars, but my mother and father didn't even call. The only updates I received about them came from Michael, my attorney, who explained that their lawyers had advised them not to contact me while the civil case was ongoing. Part of me was relieved not to have to see their faces, but another part felt the ache of abandonment more deeply than I expected. Even in my most vulnerable state, they had chosen absence over accountability. My friends, however, filled the void. Colleagues from my school visited regularly, bringing me stories from the classroom, stacks of cards from my students, and home-cooked meals to brighten the hospital fare. They organized fundraisers, creating a small cushion to help with expenses insurance wouldn't cover. Their kindness reminded me that family wasn't always defined by blood, but by presence, by who showed up when life broke you open. By the end of my second month in the center, I had made progress that surprised even me. With braces and a walker, I could manage a few labored steps between the parallel bars, each one feeling monumental even though I knew it wasn't the kind of walking I had once taken for granted. The doctors called it remarkable progress for the severity of my injury, but I knew I still had a long road ahead. My life would never be the same. And yet, slowly, I was beginning to believe that it could still be a life worth living. By the time I left the rehabilitation center and returned to my own apartment, I had begun to understand that recovery was not only about learning how to move again, but also about confronting the years of damage my family had done long before the accident. My body was weaker than it had ever been, but in many ways the old wounds ran even deeper. The accident hadn't created them, it had only exposed them so clearly that I could no longer pretend they weren't there. My therapist at the center, a woman named Claire, encouraged me to continue seeing her as an outpatient once I moved home. She specialized in trauma and family dynamics, and during our sessions she helped me trace the threads that connected the past to the present. What happened in the shed wasn't an isolated event, she told me one afternoon as I sat across from her in my wheelchair, hands clenched in my lap. It was the culmination of a lifetime of patterns: your brother's cruelty, your parents' denial, and the constant invalidation of your reality. The injury is visible. But the invisible wounds are just as important to heal. Her words landed with painful clarity. I had always believed my family's treatment of me was wrong, but I had also internalized their judgments so deeply that I questioned myself at every turn. Even lying paralyzed on the floor of the shed, I had felt that small, nagging doubt: what if they're right? What if I really am being dramatic? It was a habit formed over decades, one that wouldn't disappear just because doctors and police now confirmed what I had lived through. Week after week, Claire helped me unravel those beliefs. We talked about the golden child and scapegoat roles that had shaped our household, about how Evan had been rewarded for cruelty while I had been punished for vulnerability. We talked about the way my parents had always valued appearances over truth, how they had chosen to maintain their image of a perfect family even when it meant ignoring my pain. Your parents failed you in the most basic way, Claire said gently during one session. They had one job: to protect and care for you. Instead, they chose denial. That wasn't about you. It was about them. Hearing those words was both devastating and liberating. For so long, I had carried the belief that I was somehow to blame for my family's coldness, that if I had just been stronger, tougher, less needy, maybe they would have loved me better. But Claire reminded me again and again that the fault did not lie with me. Slowly, I began to let that truth sink in. Outside of therapy, I began to build a new kind of family, the kind I had always longed for but never believed I deserved. My friends became my anchors, showing up with groceries, helping me rearrange my apartment so it was more accessible, and keeping me company during long evenings when the silence threatened to swallow me. At first, I felt guilty accepting their help. Years of being told I was a burden made it hard to believe that anyone could show up for me without resentment. But each time they knocked on my door, each time they sat with me without expectation, that guilt began to loosen its grip. At the same time, I started to connect with the wider community of people living with spinal cord injuries. Through the rehabilitation center, I joined a support group where we shared not only our frustrations and fears but also our victories, no matter how small. Some had been injured years ago and spoke with the kind of perspective that comes from living through the long arc of recovery. Others, like me, were still raw, still learning to navigate this new world. Listening to their stories reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my struggle was shared by others who understood in ways my family never could. News of my parents trickled in from distant relatives. They had moved to Florida, selling the house where I had grown up, starting fresh in a smaller home. I heard they told neighbors and new friends a version of the story where I had suffered a tragic accident and they had been pillars of support through it all. I should have been angry at the lie, but instead I felt a strange kind of detachment. Their narrative no longer had power over me. I didn't need their acknowledgement to validate my truth. For the first time, I understood that my healing did not depend on them at all. As for Evan, letters began arriving from prison a few months into his sentence. At first, I left them unopened on my kitchen table, unable to face whatever excuses or manipulations might be inside. But eventually curiosity got the better of me, and I unfolded one. To my surprise, it wasn't full of excuses. It was an apology, clumsy, imperfect, but genuine in a way I had never heard from him before. He wrote about the therapy he was doing in prison, about finally confronting the cruelty he had shown me all our lives. He admitted that he had been wrong, that I had deserved better, that he could never undo the damage he had caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only to be heard. Reading those words left me shaken. Part of me wanted to believe him, to cling to the idea that maybe change was possible. Another part of me recoiled, unwilling to open myself to more disappointment. I didn't know if I would ever respond, and I realized I didn't need to decide right away. What mattered was that I no longer depended on his recognition, or anyone's, to believe in my own worth. At night, when pain kept me awake or when grief for what I had lost felt sharpest, I reminded myself of what Claire had told me, that healing wasn't about erasing wounds, but about transforming them into something that could give meaning. I wasn't there yet, not fully, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was walking, or wheeling, toward it. By the second year after the accident, I had begun to realize that survival and healing were two very different things. Surviving was about the day-to-day, navigating my apartment, managing my medical needs, attending therapy sessions, and learning how to live in a body that no longer matched the one I had always known. Healing, though, went deeper. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had been taught to hide, about building a life that wasn't shaped by fear, silence, or my family's denial. I moved into a ground-floor apartment with wide doorways, an accessible bathroom, and space for my wheelchair to turn without scraping against the walls. It wasn't large, but it felt like freedom. Every corner reflected choices that were mine alone, the framed photos of friends who had stood by me, the bright throw blankets draped across the couch, the low bookshelves filled with well-worn novels. For the first time in my life, my home felt like it belonged to me, not as a place where I lived under scrutiny, but as a space that welcomed me exactly as I was. Work shifted too. Teaching in a classroom was no longer possible, not in the same way, but the school district offered me a position as a curriculum specialist. It was work I could mostly do from home, creating lesson plans and resources for teachers, while occasionally visiting schools to provide training. At first, I mourned the loss of standing in front of a classroom, of hearing children's laughter fill the air. But over time, I came to see the new role as another kind of teaching, one that allowed me to reach even more students by supporting their teachers. It gave me purpose, a reminder that my career wasn't over, it had simply transformed. Outside of work, I became involved with a local advocacy group for people living with spinal cord injuries. Twice a week, I visited the rehabilitation center where I had once been a patient, now serving as a mentor for those who were newly injured. I sat beside them as they grappled with the same fear and grief I had once carried, listening as they poured out the questions that had no easy answers. Sometimes all I could offer was honesty, that it doesn't get easier, but that we get stronger, that the pain eventually becomes just one part of life rather than the whole of it. Other times, I shared practical tips or simply held space for their tears. And every time I wheeled back out of the center, I felt a quiet sense of purpose, as though my suffering had been reshaped into something that could help others. It was through this work that I met Thomas, a physical therapist who specialized in neurological injuries. At first, he was simply a colleague, someone I saw during group sessions and community events. But over time, our conversations stretched beyond work, moving into long talks over coffee or walks, well, for him, walks, and for me, rolls, through the park. He never treated me like I was fragile or defined by my disability, but he didn't ignore it either. He saw me fully, with both my scars and my strength, and for the first time I began to imagine what healthy love could look like. Our relationship grew slowly, carefully, but with a steadiness that felt like the opposite of everything I had known in my family. Meanwhile, my family remained absent. Evan was released from prison after serving his sentence, and though he wrote to me again asking if I would consider meeting him one day, I wasn't ready to decide. My parents stayed in Florida, telling their new community a version of events that painted them as devoted parents supporting their daughter through tragedy. For a while, hearing about their lies stung, but eventually I realized that their story didn't matter anymore. My truth existed whether they acknowledged it or not, and I no longer needed their validation to believe in my own worth. One of the most significant steps I took was enrolling in a master's program in educational psychology, specializing in trauma-informed teaching practices. The coursework was demanding, especially alongside physical therapy and work, but it gave me a sense of direction. I wanted to take what I had lived through, not just the accident, but the years of emotional neglect, and use it to help children who might be going through their own unseen battles. I knew what it felt like to have pain dismissed, and I wanted to ensure that the students I supported would never be made to feel invisible in the same way. Graduation came nearly 2 years to the day after the accident, and as I crossed the small stage in my wheelchair to receive my diploma, I felt a mixture of pride and disbelief. 2 years earlier, I had lain on the floor of a shed, convinced my life was over. Now, even with the challenges and limitations I faced, I was building something new, something meaningful. There were still hard days. Nights when pain spasms kept me awake, mornings when the effort of getting out of bed felt insurmountable, moments when grief for the life I had lost pressed down like a weight. But those moments no longer defined me. Instead, I carried them alongside the laughter of friends gathered in my living room, the gratitude of patients I mentored, the gentle steadiness of Thomas's hand resting in mine. Healing, I realized, wasn't about forgetting or pretending the pain had never happened. It was about weaving it into the fabric of my life in a way that gave it meaning. My injury would always be part of my story, as would the betrayal of my family. But neither would ever again be the whole of who I was.